Welcome, everybody. I'm Jonathan Gustin from Purpose Guides Institute. And if you've been listening to this series, you know that Purpose Guides Institute is a place where you can come and learn tools and techniques to discover and embody your purpose, and also to become a purpose guide yourself so you can help other people unfold and unfurl their purpose in their life as a gift of service. So this is the Purpose Summit, and I'm very happy to have today with us Rod Stryker. Welcome, Rod.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you.
And I'm just going to read a brief intro so you get a little feel for who he is. Yogarupa Rod Stryker is the founder of Para Yoga and the author of The Four Desires, Creating a Life of Purpose, Happiness, Prosperity, and Freedom. It's a book that I use in training the Purpose Guides at Purpose Guides Institute. It's very good. After decades of study and intensive practice, Rod founded Para Yoga to create a resource for the time-tested wisdom of the yoga tradition, thousands of years old. Rod is a leading spokesman for living a life of purpose, fulfillment, and freedom on two fronts. One, he offers accessible wisdom and practices to wide audiences, those who simply want to live more joyfully and effectively. He is also a leading authoritative source for experienced students and teachers of yoga and meditation. Rod is a mentor to hundreds of teachers and thousands of students worldwide. As one of the preeminent lecturers, yoga and meditation teachers in the West, Rod's down-to-earth approach is informed as much by his mastery of the sublime teachings as by his love of life and devotion to his wife and 4 children. So, with that introduction in hand, let's just jump right in. As you know, the title of this series is the Purpose Summit. So all these different teachers I've invited have a sort of a different take, a different way of holding this word. So if you would, can you let us know what that word, or a word that resonates with you, that's similar, what it means? What is purpose for a human being?
In short, first of all, thank you, Jonathan. In short, purpose is really the drive to become who we were meant to be. And I think in human terms, that becomes an almost overwhelming concept. But if we think about it in nature, and I hope to link these two ideas up as we move along. But in nature, in short, a pumpkin seed is meant to become a pumpkin. And we'll say any kind of plant, in essence, from seed to flower, it's that process of moving. There's from what is inherently in it, the inherent intelligence to be what it was meant to be, it's in it. And it's that flourishing that really speaks to what purpose is. And again, we can elaborate on it in many, many ways, but I think that's the simplest way to get to it. And the thing maybe that would be helpful to listeners, to our audience initially, is that I feel there's a lot of confusion about purpose in as much as it's often attributed to and likened to profession. So we look for profession and purpose as synonymous. In other words, to find my purpose is to know what my profession is. And I would argue that purpose is a much more overriding, a much larger idea.
Great, yeah. So, so purpose is the seed that is secreted inside a person, and we'll talk about practices, but through attention and presence and practices, one can grow into what one is always meant to be.
Right, indeed. And you know, as I said, it's a little easier to think about this in terms of nature, and we think, okay, well, yeah, obviously a tomato seed is meant to become a tomato, but then maybe a tulip is a better idea, or what would be another flower of which there are many varieties. And so where I'm coming from in purpose, and it's, I think, implicit in the bio you read, which is the idea that human beings there's two kinds of purpose, really. There's a kind of macro purpose, which is this idea that there's an intelligence overriding and pervading the natural world. And indeed, it's part of what brought us here. In fact, there's really that macro idea, but in addition to that, there's a micro idea. Is how do I serve, or how am I in relationship to this greater evolution that is taking place? And notwithstanding, when we look around the world today and see so much division and confusion and chaos and conflict, from my perspective, which is again rooted in the Vedic tradition, the kind of the body of knowledge that was the origin of yoga and things like that. Indeed, we live in an organized universe, and indeed, every being in it has a role to play in its evolution. And most importantly, to the extent that we are fulfilling that role, in other words, aligning ourselves to this larger macro evolutionary intelligence, and indeed it's called Dharma, the more we're fulfilling our own individual Dharma, the more we're supporting the evolution of that Dharma. And that is the very basis for happiness, truly. In other words, if we're walking that line of being attentive to uncovering our Dharma and then working to fulfill our Dharma, that is the core of happiness. Even more so than our landmarks of success or circumstances.
So it sounds like there's a kind of a micro dharma or micro purpose and a meta purpose. So am I hearing you correctly that to really know happiness is to be in the flow, the Tao, the Dharma of life itself? And if so, what is that meta purpose of life of, I mean, it's a hard question, but of the universe, of which we have a small part to play to midwife into reality?
Well, the larger purpose is really to glorify the source, the creating, like what's put this whole thing into being. And again, I mean, I think we're now leaning more into kind of a spiritual or religious, pseudo-religious conversation, really. And that is, why is there creation? Why did the creator not just hang out in its own creativeness, creatorness, and why move things along in this sense? And really, in essence, the answer from my studies and my tradition speaks to the idea that it glorifies, it's actually a further glorification of this source of creation. And by seeing this play, and what is it? It's in essence the desire to expand, the desire for consciousness to know itself and to be fully immersed in a completely expanded experience of self. And so really life in practical terms is pushing us there all the time. When we stagnate, it's painful. When we don't kind of listen to our intuition and our own inner sensibility, usually there's a price to pay for that. The universe is consistently telling us when we're out of step, and then initially maybe certain levels of discomfort and later disease start to show up. But what we also find is that when we are in step, as you described it, we start to thrive. We start to feel like we're in the right place, doing the right thing. And maybe most importantly, there's this very extraordinary and very distinct feeling that we are not alone, that we have a reason for being. And I'll make the case why purpose is so important, because no matter how much financial and material success we have, we can't completely control this universe. Our friends and loved ones will get sick, and all sorts of circumstances will unfold that make it so that even if we take all of our will to achieve certain landmarks and success and material accomplishment, no one has a perfect record in accomplishing all their goals. But what we can do perfectly is, once we discover our purpose, we can live our purpose perfectly. And if you are living with purpose, you are living with a constant ally to navigate the fact that life is not always and constantly supporting you. You're not always in perfect co-conspiracy to have everything you'd like, in other words. And so I may not be able to have everything I want, but I can always live with my purpose. And I can always carry that with me wherever I go, which is incredibly reassuring.
Yeah. It sounds like it's really a self-knowing. It's a recognition of your nature at a level of of purpose, of doing, of service. And when we live it, it's a joy because we're well seated in what we were always meant to be.
True. You know, the one way I put this is, if we think about this larger Dharma of which we're all a part, which basically makes trees. I live in Colorado, and that's where my part of the conversation is taking place. And we have, summer is a very short season, so soon you can already detect nights are getting cooler. Soon the leaves will start changing color. There's nothing I can do to stop that. That's the natural order. My goal is to be in harmony with it. And if we, borrowing from the earlier idea I posited, which is the idea that we're each a note in the symphony of creation. And if we're not playing our instrument, which is living our life fully, somehow that symphony is either disrupted or it's lacking in the fullness and the potential. So indeed, it is about both serving our highest self-interest, we could call it enlightened self-interest, in a way that continues to support and nurture this continuing unfoldment.
Great. I'm just going to pause for a second because I noticed that I look like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, light here and dark here. So I'm going to simply just turn on the light. So everybody, hold on 1 second. Okay.
Wow. You just called in the lighting specialist.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, there's this word, there's this ancient Greek word, entelechy, that I'm reminded of. Aristotle apparently coined it, that he said an entelechy is a thing's full fruition or blossoming. And he used the acorn as an example. He said, within the acorn is the oak tree, and the oak tree is the entelechy of the acorn. And our job, he said, is to find out when we are in our acorn state, is what we are being magnetized into. That really seems to be what you're speaking to.
Yeah, indeed. Aristotle was my favorite philosopher, and when I studied philosophy, and indeed, he echoed in my mind as I was beginning to learn Vedic wisdom. And so, yeah, that's precisely it. And so, from that comes the idea that discovering one's purpose is really an uncovering, as opposed to a creative writing experience. Going on this idea you just described of the acorn, in other words, there's already a spiritual blueprint for who we are going to become, or how we contribute to this larger aspect of creation and this larger intelligence and this larger purpose. It's encoded in us. And so the way I describe the process of getting to it is not like, well, wow, Steve Jobs had such a cool one, and Mahatma Gandhi had a cool purpose, and Mother Teresa, or whomever you want to come up with in your mind. It's essential that we understand it's an extremely organic process. At least from my point of view, we can't pick something that seems valuable or meaningful. We have to actually find an authentic mark, the authentic source of what it actually is. Because it gets very tricky. Very often we do what we're good at. We feel magnetized to what we're good at, but not necessarily what is profoundly authentic. This is why the whole idea of the family dynamics and the role we played when we were young may have been how we coped with how we actually found or situated ourselves within a family dynamic. But we find later in life that wasn't actually something authentic. And so it's vital that we take time to reflect, and we do this work of uncovering what is indeed a kind of encoded, we could almost call it our soul's blueprint. And that's the point of view that we come from on it. It's not about finding someone else's who is really cool and kind of thinking that's nice, but rather finding what is indeed embedded deep within you.
Yeah. Well, so that sounds very different than, one of the thoughts out there in modernity and in society is you can be anything you want. You can choose your destiny, who you're going to become. And what you're saying is really sort of flying in the face of that. It's saying, no, don't sit there and look at all of the options, rather kind of go inside and see what's true. at the core of your being. And in that way, the path becomes incredibly narrow. It's your one particular flower.
Yeah, I think there's a little more nuance in that.
Yeah, please.
Because let's be clear. Like, so going back to my, the earlier point I was making. For example, you can have two attorneys with a very different purpose. What does being an attorney mean, and how do they resonate with it? What are they looking for out of it? Two very different actors who are in the same profession, but find a different reason to act, Yeah. And you can think of that in every profession. So in that sense, you can fulfill your mission, your purpose, through a variety of different paths, in essence. So, for example, if you find for me, I would suggest to one that you won't know your purpose until it can touch the full span of all aspects of your life. So my purpose as a yoga teacher, meditation teacher, speaker, should also be reflected in how I parent. Now, I use a different voice, but so that I don't want to quite say you're confined in as much as you can't follow other interests, because indeed you can channel your purpose through a variety of roles. I think destiny is a kind of a little bit of another conversation, but from, again, a traditional Vedic perspective, it's a kind of 50-50 proposition. There are certain things that are indeed embedded, and destiny is determined. Our major life lessons are determined. That ties into this idea of individual purpose. How long we'll live, those things are evidently pretty embedded. Yeah. So, but we have some freedom to create different destiny, and again, find that authentic, purpose-driven call, and then let it breathe in the world and guide you.
Yeah. Let me say that back to, I like what you're saying very much, this distinction. So at the level of roles, there's actually quite a bit of choice, but at the level of what we're actually delivering, there is something very special and unique. So for instance, if a metaphor I make is that if you order a pizza, you can, it's just a pizza, but it can be the delivery vehicle. It can be delivered by foot, by bike, by car, by truck. So there's a variety of ways for you to deliver what you have. So like Freud and Jung were both psychiatrists, but when you read their work, you get they're not the same. They each had something very unique, a genius in them, but that was quite different.
Absolutely. I describe it as, sometimes I'll describe it as a ray. It's a distinct ray. And in the same way there's colors of the spectrum, that's one way to think about it. And some of us, no matter what we do, we are that red. And you can be a red attorney, a red actor, a red therapist, a red whatever. And that's it. Now there's further granulation within saying, oh, I'm a red, or I'm an orange, or I'm a purple. But we're on, yes, indeed. I think you're getting a sense of it, and I think I'm expressing it in a way that to make these fine distinctions, that's right. That is the important thing to recognize.
Yeah. No, I mean, amongst other things, I'm a psychotherapist, and what I noticed is, if I study Carl Rogers or Jung or Freud or Adler or any of these things, they're not all delivering the same thing. Something very unique is coming through them, and so it's always a little bit strange in a sense when someone becomes a certified Jungian analyst, because Carl Gustav himself said, well, don't do that, become your own thing. Of course he dies and then everyone does it, but I always find that a little humorous.
Yeah
You harkening back to something you said kind of a few paragraphs ago, around where you are at, what you're sort of called to do to both cope and contribute to your family of origin. One of the things that's come up in this series is this question of the sacred wound, the places where we feel hurt or injured or wounded as a younger person. And some teachers seem to think that is like the preeminent or even a necessary way, a portal to living your purpose. Others think not. And I'm wondering where you are on that sort of spectrum. Is it necessary to does everyone by definition have this wound? And if they don't, then I guess it's not a portal. And if they do, is it necessary to always sort of excavate what that was and to allow it to sort of heal and be the portal through which your purpose emanates?
That's a really excellent, really excellent question, insightful question. So so part one is the idea of whether or not everyone has one. And the answer would be, from my perspective, from the tradition's perspective, 100% yes. There is inherently a division that is responsible for us taking shape. So it's even, again, this is a little bit, again, from a Vedic perspective, it even precedes the family. In essence, your soul has come with it. It then chooses the family or the circumstances that may be early in life, that may psychologically be very impactful and shape our psyche. It actually, those are crystallizations of what is in a non-formed state. So that potential prior to taking birth is already in place. So is that leverage, or is this a critical piece of the purpose? And yes, absolutely, 100%. In fact, if someone's purpose, once you articulate it, and I think it's really critical that this becomes something that is articulated. We have become so clear about it that it's not a vague sense of, well, I'm meant to bring love and light into the world. Well, welcome to the human, the core human drive. Sooner or later, we all discover that it does come down to love and light. But on an individual level, if our articulated purpose is not helping us to outgrow or overcome or challenge the kind of stasis, the crystallization or the wound, as you described it, then I would say you don't have a full understanding of the purpose. And so it's this embrace of it that's absolutely critical. But then the question, because now I almost sounds like it becomes counterintuitive, because I said, on the one hand, the idea of our purpose is something bigger than just, that's not our destiny. It's not now predetermined. But in essence, what it means is, how do I take that into account, and what's the process of outgrowing it? I'm not confined to it for the rest of my life. I have that choice. That's where free will comes into play. And invariably, in the work of the Four Desires, what we do, we start this process of fishing out the purpose. And by that, I mean, it's not a creative writing process. It's really a discovery and uncovering process, as I said earlier. But the really critical work is to discover the wrong purpose or the wrong drive that let's call it dysfunctional. The one you've taken ownership of that is actually shaping your decisions and actions and thoughts. And it's really important. This is something that I'd want to convey in this conversation, and that is that all of us are being driven by something. We all are being driven to make choices, positive or negative, to start some things and not complete them, to not begin some things that we really want to accomplish, to step into and actually continue to do things that are not helpful. And very often, if we step back, we could possibly recognize that, it's almost happening to me, rather than me determining every step of the way. If I ask now, there's this startling statistic, and I just like saying it. The current statistic is that Westerners check their social media on average 84 times a day. 84 times a day. And there's just nothing constructive about that whatsoever. But once, and then there's part of the we can make a case for the neural patterning that's starting to take place. It becomes an addiction and triggers dopamine release and all sorts of things. But something drives our behavior. And the point is that it's actually more important to understand. It's as important, I shouldn't say more. It's as important to understand those fundamental ideas or beliefs that are driving us away from the core authentic purpose as it is to discover the purpose, the authentic purpose. And that's why I take as much time in the Four Desires. And the truth is that in the book itself, it plays such a critical role that very often people will stop right there because it marks about the midway point in the book. And this is essentially now we're being driven by something other than this authentic, life-sustaining, fulfilling purpose. It's vital that people see that. And then part two, it's vital that their purpose includes the resolution, living through, resolving this thing, because that also has to become part of our purpose. As I said, there's very little imprinted in us in terms of destiny. It's all yours except for what are the major life lessons I have to learn? And then how long do I get to live? So it's a long answer, but it was such a wonderful question. It speaks to the core of what we have to understand about purpose. Indeed, it's driven by whether it's family or it's even prior to our birth. It's definitely a piece of a vital thread of what is our unique purpose.
Mm-hmm. I have like 10 follow-up questions to that,
right.
But we only have so much time. So I think actually I'm going to segue because there's another sort of key word that really informs and is infused throughout this whole summit. And it's this word soul. And people come to it from a variety of different places, and you come from the Vedic tradition. And so first of all, what is soul? And how is it synonymous with this word purpose or not? So just maybe if you could unpack soul a little bit for
a little bit, sure. Yeah, let me try and make this less than a 2-week answer.
Okay.
So again, I'm just going to do my best to just put into common language what is this ancient teaching on soul, and it deeply resonated with me and has been really validated in my own experience within my meditation practice that's gone on for about 40 years, and in terms of living. So in essence, the tradition speaks about this idea that there's two aspects to soul. So let me I kind of have to include both to define it.
Please.
The first one is called the higher soul. In Veda, it would be called Param Atma. So Para means higher, above, highest, and Atman means self or soul. And it's the idea that in the Vedic wisdom that Param Atman is actually the same as the source of life. There is no distinction or disruption or degradation between the divine, source, essence, truth, God. I use that word last because that's the one that's usually the most triggering. There's no distinction between God and this higher soul.
Okay.
And that each of us hold a spark that is that great combustible, that great force that is the light of the universe. So, and they literally call them the great statements. The Mahavakyas are, for instance, Tat Tvamasi, it means thou art that. And it's pointing to what that essence is. And then they use this term to make a distinction. They said, and then there's the Jiva Atman. The Jiva means individual soul. And in this context, the idea is that it's a mixture of the Paramatman, which is the highest pure intelligence, consciousness, but it's mixed with unconsciousness. It's mixed, it's just that slight interface. And it's the jiva that carries the lessons from every individual life. And that's why it connects this earlier teaching that says, even prior to birth, the lesson that we need to learn, what we need to complete, how we specifically need to expand our consciousness, our self-awareness is already implanted. Where is it implanted? In the jiva. And so therefore, through the course of our life, then we have both this undiluted aspect of divinity or the source of life, that's soul, but also soul is this subtle aspect, which I think Jung would have leaned into the term psyche. It is this idea of spirit, but spirit in a slightly conditioned way that makes us the distinct acorn that we are. And whether we're a tulip bulb or a pumpkin seed, that's in the jiva.
Wow. Okay. I'm just taking that all in.
Okay.
Hmm. There's a few ways I can go with this. So, soul. It's
You know, and maybe, you know, we can go in a few directions, because I know, you know, within this context of purpose driven life and finding this context in finding meaning in one's life, you've included meditation and self-reflection and contemplation to be part of that vital curriculum and support. And so meditation, in many ways, if we think about it, is actually fulfilling, gaining access to both of these realms, both aspects of the soul. One is that, that aspect of soul that is absolutely free of all conditions, and one with the universe itself. And then at the same time, meditation is also a way of understanding, how does my soul show up purposefully today through this unique ray called my jiva. And as the mind becomes quieter, a kind of deeper intelligence in the mind starts to surface, then there's insight about, how do I shine? What challenge do I need to overcome? We get clarity, we get vision. So the value of a spiritual practice in the midst of all this is it continues to align ourselves with these two aspects of the soul.
beautiful. Well, so that's a very interesting topic. So maybe you can help clarify something for me. I think I'm still under perhaps a misperception around classical meditation. When I was quite young, 16, I came across the work of Ramana Maharshi. To me, a great illumined sage. I mean, just amazing, and he continues to be one of my root teachers. But his outer life, I jokingly call him a one loincloth type of guy. He would sit at the base of this mountain. He was in love with it. But in terms of relationships or common joys or so forth, it seemed to me his sort of specialization, if you will, would be to just be a transmitter of unbounded non-dual awareness. And I think the thing is in meditating in that lineage with this question, who am I or what am I? The place where it seemed to lead, and maybe you can correct me, wasn't about purpose. It wasn't about the becoming. It was very much about, who you are before time and space and so forth. So it almost seems like it got divided. On the one hand, I went to the non-dual traditions of Advaita Vedanta and Zen, and on the other hand, reading Hillman and Bill Plotkin and others around, the becoming and the purpose aspect. Did I miss something in Ramana Maharshi and then Dogen in the Zen tradition, because it really seemed like the purpose of classical meditation was classical enlightenment, getting off the wheel of samsara, if you will. I definitely see in my own work and in my own life that meditation makes me more permeable, more open to purpose. But is it actually embedded in the ancient teachings of meditation?
Well, yes. I mean, the distinction's a valuable one, and I think it's worth us talking about it for a few minutes.
Please.
Much as there is some confusion about that, and indeed, non-dualism gets a lot of really positive press, as it were, and I mean, again, for some people, if people are not familiar with this conversation, is reality dual or non-dual? I think it actually can be really boring and banal, to be honest with you. But for those of us who walk down this path, it is kind of intriguing, but it does create a lot of possible obstacles, actually.
Yeah.
And I touch upon this in my book, because in the book, I really felt like I wanted to speak to both the non-yoga audience and the yoga audience. And, when you get in front of a non-yoga audience and you speak to these principles of purpose, living wisely, making good choices, finding something authentic, people are really cool with that. Yeah. If you get in front of a yoga audience, they're like questioning you at the first step, which is, wait a minute, isn't my job to get out of this world? The more I engage in the world, the more I'm attached. And so that's why in the book, I spent a little bit of time covering this concern, this little bit of cognitive dissonance around that yoga practitioners, meditation practitioners, and Buddhists and Eastern contemplative students might have. In essence, the tradition makes very clear two paths to freedom and fulfillment. And number one path is, they call it nivritti, which is what you talked about in describing Ramana Maharishi. In short, for most of us, it's totally inappropriate, because while non-dualism sounds so fantastic, if you're truly in a non-dualistic state, you don't know today is Friday. You don't know that we arranged our meeting for 11:30. Time is completely dualistic. You don't really care whether you eat organic quinoa today for lunch, because those are all distinctions, ergo duality. If you are a householder, and more importantly, the tradition says, if you have still duties to discharge, which is really where we started with, it's you have a purpose to fulfill, and by you fulfilling your purpose, you're actually gracing the world in a way. You're contributing to the world. You're affecting not just potentially your children or your maid or your partners, but your business. It's affecting all sorts of things. So the other path that they actually described was called pravritti, and pravritti means to expand. And what I would say is I'm a conditional non-dualist. And the idea here is that at the right time, ergo, specifically retirement age, you start pursuing non-dualism full on. You understand it's in the background, but it's simply not it's not even appropriate. Nothing is worse than not discharging your duty or fulfilling your purpose in a given lifetime. That's really one of the cardinal sins, if you will, within Veda. You have duties to perform here. You can't step into meditation where everything is just so rosy and etheric and blissful and non-dual, and just then choose to disengage with the world when you come out of meditation. Ramana Maharishi was at the end of the journey, but he doesn't represent householders. And a householder is a very broad term to say those of us who might have kids or jobs or earn a living or have a creative impulse or something like that. Indeed, Ramana had to be reminded to eat, because hunger is dualistic. He slept where he taught, and he would be woken when someone had a question. And for him, there was no difference between the waking, dreaming, and sleeping state. So that's why I say conditional non-dualism is the way I would go. At the right time, non-dualism is wonderful. But in the meantime, there is no shortcut to fulfilling your duty and learning your life lesson. There's this term, I think, it's being used a lot now, called spiritual bypass. And I think, the area around non-dualism and this kind of forcing yourself into disengagement with practical worldly stuff is actually a convenient way to bypass the deeper lessons of life that we are here to fulfill, to learn. Yeah. And I think it's really quite critical, and it's a little bit of something that I'm concerned of in the spiritual world today, actually. People lean into this idea, and I feel very blessed because I got a rendering of Veda that was extremely practical. My last words in the book, I don't have it in front of me, so I can't quote it, but I'm quoting the Veda. And it says, the last words of the most ancient text on the planet, existent text on the planet, are, may we walk together, may we eat together, may we share in life's bounty. It's not may we all disappear. It's actually a description of, here's these teachings, the most lofty and noble teachings and reflections on existence. And the summation of it is, may we talk together in peace. May we share in life's bounty. It's not may we disappear. May we transcend it all. And that's, I think, a really, I mean, it's a conversation worthy of having.
Yeah. I just want to lean into that for one more moment before I go on to the next question. So, the Ramana Maharshi path is not for me, and it's not for hardly anybody, which is fine. And I love him, and I so appreciate what he has done for me and the world. But I wonder if there is the possibility This isn't something I've experienced, abiding non-dual awareness. But it seems to me that one could fulfill one's purpose. One could let their purpose come into full flowering. But the center of gravity of identity wouldn't be the personal. It wouldn't be, Jonathan, the little ego. In theory, I could continue to do this purpose work, but there would be a change in occupancy from, little me to just this, to awareness itself. So instead of having to be reminded to eat and so forth, there would be this like co-arising awakening, classical enlightenment, and this great thirst to serve and become. But the identity, the pusto, the place from which that purpose emanated, was this unbounded awareness. Now, I don't live from that place in an ongoing place. I've tasted it in meditation. So it's speculative for me. But it seems to me that maybe it doesn't have to be one and then the other. And I'm wondering what you think about that.
No, you're right, Jonathan. That's really a wonderful and a wonderful depiction of the terrain. And indeed, it's not like one day, literally it was a day you shift from a dual to a non-dual perspective. You now go, okay, I've got my kids through college. I've done this. I've done that. I've written my 2 or 3 books. I'm done. Now I'm going to concentrate on non-dualism. If you have spent the first 60 to 70 years of your life completely immersed in dualism and expect to actually have any access to non-dualism, this ultimate experience, you're in for a rude awakening. It has to be cultivated along the way. And indeed, that's when I spoke earlier about meditation in relation to Jiva and Paratman. I did say, although you're helping flesh it out even more, I did say that it speaks to both the possibility of a clear vision of how I expand in and fulfill my duties in a more meaningful, more complete way. And at the same time, it gives me access to that view of this authentic, the source of life itself, which is by nature non-dual.
Yeah.
And the paradigm, as you described it, where it doesn't become a division, it becomes parallel paths. And that you get to cross the street into non-dualism on a consistent basis. And by the way, the beauty of that is that not only are you preparing the ground for what ideally, ultimately, we will achieve in this life, because that's also our purpose, is to achieve self-realization, to really know who we were, beyond the personal. Who am I beyond the personal? But what it also is doing is gradually teaching you to become less possessed by your possessions. And if I step into this non-dual awareness, even occasionally, you meditate every day, for example, and you get there once a week, you get 3 seconds. The coming out of that is a reminder that there's nothing to take too seriously, that you're in possession of nothing. At some level of awareness, you're in possession of no thing, and you are no one. I hope that's clear. You are no one personal thing. You are non-dual. And in that sense, it allows us to live with more grace and more freedom. And in essence, I've taken in the last year to start developing some course content around that. And I've realized, and I'll share something just briefly with you, and that is, I have found in the last 5 years or so, people's minds are deteriorating. Now, I can't speak for all of the amazing people that are listening to us speak. This is already a very selective, self-selected demographic. But generally, people's lack of concentration, attentiveness, the ability to hold a single thought for anything less than 1 second, our inability to sustain an activity and not be multitasking while we're doing it, it's almost gone to this point. As a result, people's capacity to reach some depth in their meditation practice is also being affected. And so, I'm glad I'm not starting my 40 years of meditation today, because of the intense assault on our senses and the lack of focus and concentration. I'm grateful that I have the 40 years behind me. But the good news is there are practices called Yoga Nidra, which help you access this state of awareness that's beyond sleeping, dreaming, and waking, that give us access to this place of non-dual awareness. But they come much more quickly. The experiences and glimpses of that state come much more quickly. And so anyway, I kind of went off on that, but I do think, since you and I are speaking about such rarefied air and experience, it's worthy of putting it into context.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not, Ramana, as you said, such an extraordinary being. How many beings on the planet currently have access to that state? It's not a lot. Yeah, it's just not.
Well, let's come down from the rarefied. I love talking about non-duality, but probably lost the whole bunch of our audience. So for those of you remaining, we'll continue with the subject of purpose. So I guess one just very key question is, so if this is a real thing, if this is a reality, not just a narrative or story that the mind creates, if we really have inside of us a soul level purpose, why is it that so many people, like the way I describe it is, we live in a kind of a soul or purpose illiterate culture, that it seems to me we all do have a purpose. And it's often, the default purpose of accumulating more success, more wealth, and so forth. And I have nothing against safety, security, belonging, and being esteemed. In fact, I desire those things very much. But it seems to me, as a society, we tend to hyper-focus on those things so much that even the conversation of a deep soul level purpose doesn't really come up. So I'm wondering, do you agree that to some degree we live in a soul or purpose illiterate society? And if so, what's going on with that? Why wouldn't we naturally, as we have a natural hunger for sex and food and joy and so forth, why does it seem that it gets either thwarted or twisted so much?
Wow. Well, there's a lot of, I think a lot of things can rise out of, a lot of answers can rise out of that question. I do think, I had a teacher who told, one of my first teacher actually had a teacher, and all he would do, his sole teaching was a simple question. He would ask question of students: are you awake? That's it. Are you awake? And it was like a Zen koan in a sense, where you're simply, am I fully present? Am I fully present? And I just think that the Sufis say that life is seductive. We also seen this in Tantra. They say that we live in something, a kind of a world of enchantment. They call it the triple world of enchantment or seduction, where our senses and our preferences and our beliefs constantly seduce us and pull us outward. As you said, no problem pursuing sex. Before biological urges, no hassle. I mean, it takes a lot of effort not to be ruled by 4 biological urges: sex, survival, sleep, and hunger. And that's, and really you're starting, I don't think this is new. Otherwise, why would Aristotle or Socrates have needed to kind of provide a message, or Moses, or or the Vedas? Why would they have to come into being? Why isn't this a natural inclination? And it's for this very reason, I think earlier I said, the very fact that we come into life, we come into birth, is already a sign of a certain division within this whole non-dual state. It's a certain separation from our soul, the very fact we take life. And it's not so much the New Testament, it's not so much this Adam and Eve principle of original sin, but there's just a certain identification with our bodies, a certain identification with our senses, a certain identification with persona that begins to unfold. And we do get caught up in success and comfort, and it's important we don't deny them. But on the other hand, the nature of our soul is I would say is a kind of hidden. It's a hidden wisdom. There are metaphors throughout the contemplative Eastern traditions where they talk about the soul being like a lotus. The heart lotus is one of the Buddha's famous teachings. and the Heart Sutra. And the heart lotus, or the other one that we find, is that the cave, that the heart is like, in the abode of the soul is likened to a cave. It means that it's hidden. A lotus flower only opens in light. And it means that only when we come to a certain level of self-recognition, our recognition is a kind of light or seeing, that we see there's something more than these four biological urges or satisfying ourselves in a very temporal way. An intriguing teaching within the Vedantic tradition is the idea that there are three ways that we respond to the world. One is immediate gratification. I think that's the great, I wouldn't say, actually, I think the great majority of humanity lies between the first and the second. And the second is that there's a certain social order. In yoga studios, or when you're going to meditate, you take your shoes off, you don't come in. So there's certain social accepted behavior. The first experience of that is our family. So most of us are dominated by one or two, or somewhere a mix of those two things, where we're instantly gratifying ourselves. Get out of the way. I'll resort to violence if necessary to get what I want right now. And the other is that we kind of play within a social agenda. I'll give you what you want if you give me what I want. And, ergo, we kind of wind up in dysfunctional families, and there's good in that. But the noble aspect of discovering one's purpose and holding fast to that is so exceptional. And that I have to invoke, that I evoke Socrates for, because here he's preaching the truth, that the state, in essence, empowering individuals in the way, and neither of us is on his level, obviously, but in the way of saying, let's become empowered as individuals. You're more important than state. You're more important, that you kind of reach awareness, self-awareness, and you act accordingly. That's the most vital truth. And that comes right out of Veda, by the way. Pursue your higher self-interest. We won't tell you whether passivity or resorting to defending the good is important. You must do yoga. You must quiet and still your mind and then act accordingly. That's the central message of the Bhagavad Gita. And so what I'd say is just, you ask a question that really speaks to this, the unique individual who's courageous enough and desperate enough to want to live the truth. And as much as I'd like everyone in the world to join us in this conversation, I'm aware that a lot of people are distracted pursuing other things that obliterate the subtlety of these messages and ultimately the profound reward that they offer.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Yeah. So I have a few personal questions, and feel free to swat any of them away. But I guess one question I have, when I read your book and go on your website, I can see your, what was that metaphor? The delivery vehicle, an author, a yoga teacher, a meditation teacher. So, but your purpose, like in all these different things that you do, what is the pizza, if you will? What do you identify as your purpose, if you'd be willing to share?
I'd rather not unfurl the whole thing. It's actually four statements, to be honest with you, and in part so I'll just give you a bit of the synthesis. So clearly it's about, there's a certain commitment that I've recognized. It's a big part of my life, which is to ultimately bring more light into the world, to bring more of that. Now, I can do that as a parent, and I can do that as a partner to my wife, and I can do that as a teacher. Fortunate in that way. I can do it through writing. Another thought I had, and this was really kind of touches upon something that we discussed earlier, which is, to what extent does the wound play into your purpose? And I made the statement that unless you're taking that into account, I don't think you've fully fleshed out your purpose. And so for me, at some level, is to accept a level of enormity, if you will. It's been one of the areas that I have grown in through the recognition of my purpose. and particularly in the last 5 to 10 years, have begun to take more and more ownership of, and it continues to unfold itself, is this idea of being willing to become more influential in my own vision, and not keeping it into a kind of quiet little world, but rather, and I'm using the word enormity because it actually came up in a meditation, which is, what if the way I'm affecting and influencing people became enormous? And so it's embracing this enormity. And it doesn't mean, hopefully it doesn't mean enormous ego, but it means a willingness to expand the reach of sharing my light, if you will. It also part of it, if I will, add to that, and that is there's a certain aspect of self-care that is part of also my purpose. A little bit of that image of the what they tell you every time you get on an airplane, which is, put your own oxygen mask on first before you help other people. My default position and part of my family dynamic was not consistent with that. I was making sure everyone had that on, had their oxygen, and right to the point of not having any air. And so part of my purpose is also to nurture myself. And I know that when I am attentive to that, I can serve those other aspects much more meaningfully. And so that's a bit of a glimpse of it. And I know I'm speaking in more general terms, but again, it meets the criteria. Number one, it gives me a clear sense of how to act. Is it enormous? Is it shedding more light? Is there a certain aspect of self-nurturance and self-care here? And then two, it allows me then, so that's part of it, it's actionable. And then also it touches on the full spectrum of my life. There's every role I conceivably currently have and will have. I think I can channel that ray of purpose through those things. That's kind of how I'd answer the personal version of this.
Yeah. I want to lean into it a little bit more. And again, feel free to take it any way you'd like. In my work, I say there's sort of 8 facets of purpose. And one of them I call the giveaway. It's the unique transformational process that I do in a variety of delivery vehicle, systems. So for instance, I have a task. And one of my tasks is to build Purpose Guides Institute. And I guess, one day maybe it could be finished. I don't know. I retire or die. But what is the process that I'm doing in there? And so I use a shorthand of, well, when people come to me, they are not necessarily living from their fullness, their wholeness, and they thirst and ache and long for that wholeness, to wake up to classical enlightenment, to grow up into emotional adulthood, and to grow down, if you will, into their soul's unique purpose. So that's the giveaway. That's the proposition, the process that I attempt through a variety of different techniques and supports. So I'm wondering with you, if there's a particular task or mission that you feel is really yours. I think you actually talked a little bit about it already. And then what is the thing you do? What is the kind of the goal? People come to you in this state, and then maybe if they're successful and really apply themselves, they leave in another state.
So I've got part 2. Can you re-ask part 1?
Part 1. Probably not. So just coming out. So what is your task or mission? And then what I really want to hear is, what is your giveaway? That process, the steps, the way people come to you, and what you hope to see when they have maybe completed their time in being influenced by you.
Wow, beautiful. First of all, let me just say it's such a pleasure to be asked questions by someone who's so deep in this work. And so I really appreciate your ability to articulate the terrain and for us to have this conversation. I'm going to answer it first in a more topical way, but it gives you an insight into it. So over the last, particularly the last 3-4 years, so much has happened politically and socially in our landscape. And I've thought multiple times, and this even goes back further, but particularly, it's been challenging, I think, as an individual to watch, with my personal values, to watch things unfolding. And I've more than once thought about, to what extent should I use my platform to begin to become a little more socially active, kind of push a social agenda? And I've consistently come back to the same answer through meditation, and that is that it's not my gift. It's not what I'm meant to offer. And to the opposite, and this actually answers your question more specifically, is really to create a refuge. What I offer is the opportunity for a refuge where people can begin to feel comfortable and understand the value of, and then be delivered the methodologies to begin to enter into this place that you and I have been talking about throughout this conversation, both in its aspect of how do I live a more meaningful life, and two, how do I rest? How do I find that rest, an abode? In my mind, I can't do both. Par Yoga, which is the main vehicle for these many years, has been, if I start putting Par Yoga social media posts about my personal opinion about current administration or a particular policy or climate change, what I realized early on is that, there's some really good people on both sides of those conversations, all of who need a refuge. Yoga is, I actually gave a talk recently about tribalism in the yoga world, and fear, and the way fear plays out in society and tribalism in general. And one of the things I said is, people are under the wrong impression, or this impression that if Republicans just did enough yoga, they would become liberals. That is simply wrong. That's just not right.
I'm getting a picture of Ronald Reagan doing a ton of yoga, and then he's just more himself.
No. Yeah. Yes, thank you. He will be that color. That's where we started this conversation. He will be more himself. Now, what I'd like to do is help him relieve his stress and make good decisions based on his unique way, because I trust that the universe actually does want this alchemy of different views and things like that. But again, the dysfunction happens not because we are different at a jiva level. It comes from these false assumptions, false beliefs, these dysfunctional aspects in our family dynamics, and we start taking that on as the mission. So getting back to your question, for me, it's to really create a refuge where authentic wisdom can help people move back or re-enter into a realm of the sacred, right, where they can hear the voice of their own conscience, both touch their heart in such a way that they can find a kind of absence of fear, or let's say a significant reduction in fear, to find an inherent joy and peace. And then indeed, for desires being about how you manifest that in the world. How do you manage that wonderful feeling that you get through these practices? And so it was to create, and it was originally, and even as I've asked myself this question over the last decades, and particularly in the last few years as things have seemed to have exacerbated in terms of conflict, it's still the same job. My job is to lead from that perspective. And this is not a condemnation of yoga teachers who are social activists, but I would argue that many of them are not actually providing the depth of yoga experience into the place, in the context you and I have talked about. And so ultimately, I really trust the universe has put this array of different instruments in the world, in the symphony of creation. My job is to help people get familiar with their instrument, possibly play it, hear what the true notes are from their instrument, and then play it well. And from that standpoint, it's not about us all being the same instrument. It's the nuance and the beauty and the intricacy and the counter notes and notes that make life as beautiful as it can be, really as extraordinary as it can be.
Poetically, beautifully put. So I want to, as we come in for a landing, get practical here. So is there a practice you could offer the viewers right now, a little baby step forward, a toe in the water? So if they're like, okay, yes, purpose, all right, what is one thing I could do, or practice or meditation I could do right now that would potentially open me up to my soul, to this soul level purpose? Is there something, some little initial practice you could offer?
You know, this is something that since I saw you last, Jonathan, it's been a few years, I created a workbook on the Four Desires that actually moves people through the process. And since the book came out, I realized I wanted to create a little more granulation in the process, a few more helpful steps along the way. And so this is actually in the workbook. It's not in the book. And so really, if I understand you correctly, in terms of getting closer to purpose, it's not about a little more peace of mind. It's not about the refuge. It's about getting a clear sense of purpose. Here's what I would say. Again, the core, you already have a purpose. It's in you. It's in all of us. And it rises to the surface as much when we're feeling great sense of satisfaction and fulfillment and self-confidence as it does in those rare moments that I think most, at least once in our life, where we were thriving on an experiential level, we were thriving despite our circumstances. That somehow something was in play. It's like, I call it our peak redemptive moment, where there was a moment of redemption where fight against you, and you rose through it, and understanding what was at play in that very process. And the way, so in other words, again, I just want to restate this. You were thriving, but not because of your circumstances, almost in spite of your circumstances. And it was the challenging of the status quo, or what was overwhelming you or challenging you, and seeing and experiencing what comes through. And the way I have, and so that very much describes at least part of our purpose. So what I do in the Four Desires process, again, a couple additional pieces since the book, is I have people write a poem. And usually when I say this, you can feel there's a little bit of room, because people have a lot of value judgments about poem. It doesn't have to rhyme, doesn't have to have a specific number of lines, words on a line, just all it's going to just allow your consciousness to just pen to paper. Don't edit. And it's really compelling. All these people who are like, a lot of self-doubt about the ability to write a poem. I ask a few people to the group, and invariably, I mean, more times than not, people are moved to tears because of the setup. I mean, we're talking about a kind of a heightened soul experience moment. So what I have people do, and here's I'm giving away 1/4 of the process in terms of the purpose, is I set it up as such. I kind of get them into a meditative state. I said, quiet your mind, follow your breathing. Nothing exceptional in the meditation technique. And then in the last part, when their minds are quiet, I ask them to begin to reflect on it, to feel it on a tactile level, on that time in their life where they were feeling it. What were they seeing? What were they sensing? What were the emotions moving through them? And most importantly, what was arising in you to get you to this place where you move through this challenging event? I then have them open their eyes. I don't let them write for more than 5 minutes. It's like a 5-minute process. So the whole thing can take maybe 10 to 12 minutes. I then have them look at the poem. And once now they've written the poem out of a meditative awareness, pen to paper, and then I simply have them start to circle phrases or words that feel the most impactful, that are the most resonant or the most powerful distillations. And I just did this recently. I gave just a little preview of the Four Desires. I was in Germany just last week. And I had people do this. And then I asked for volunteers. Does anyone not want to read it, but is willing to? Because those are the ones I'm really interested in. I don't really want the person who's raising their hand like mad. I want the person who's willing to, but doesn't want to. Because it means there's something very dear and secret, almost very intimate there. But so I asked for a volunteer, and this woman said something about, her words were, I soften around the not knowing. You know, what that means to you and I have I mean, we can interpret it. It meant something very deep, and she was speaking about near loss of a child at birth. I found out later. I simply then asked her, because what I'll do is I ask them to read one or two highlights, almost done here, ask you to look back at what those are, and then I say, pick out one or two or three of those. If you were to do it, would it change your life trajectory? And I asked this woman, these were her words, and what I do is I usually write down, as they're reading them out loud, I'll write down the one or two that I've never heard before, because it indicates to me that it's totally unique. It is, by definition, jiva. It's very individual. I don't want to hear I give love. I mean, it's fine, but I'm not going to write it down. I give love. I've heard it 1,000 times, but I've never heard I soften around the not knowing. I said, well, her name's not important. I said, would softening around the not knowing change the trajectory of your life today and for this foreseeable future? She said, oh my God, that's the key. That's the critical. If I did that. And I said, well, just take that as the beginning of understanding your life purpose. As I said, mine's made up of 4 different statements. I described 3. And that is the fastest way. And by the way, I find the poem to be the most organic. There's other processes, for instance, in the book, that are a little more thought out. But this is so organic that usually it's highly unusual for someone's purpose at the end, life purpose, to not somehow be inclusive of at least 1 or 2 things that came out of their poem.
Fantastic.
And so it's a phenomenal, organic, fluid process. And it's as simple as that. I soften around the not knowing, which for this woman had so much meaning. And she said her eyes opened after class. There were tears coming down her eyes. She said, this is like a key opening a door.
Well, so before I ask the last 3 questions, where can people, people can find the book, The 4 Desires, on Amazon or in their bookstore. Where can they find this workbook, this poem purpose process? Where can they connect with it?
It is on Amazon. Indeed, now it's on Amazon.
Okay.
But if they want to get actually the book, it's called The 4 Desire Workbook.
Oh, The 4 Desire Workbook. Okay, so there's the 4 Desires book and the 4 Desires workbook. Great. Okay, terrific. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a synthesis. It really drives people through the process. I speak in narrative is different. It's a little bit more, I don't know. It's just a little more conversational. It pushes people forward. And it refers to parts of the book to read prior to a new exercise.
Great.
Very practical.
And while we're talking about your work, can you just say what your website is so that those viewers who are interested in going deeper into your work and teachings can locate you?
Thank you. It's Para, P-A-R-A, yoga, one word, P-A-R-A, yoga.com. And you can find the schedule. They can find kind of the general offering and the offerings and a description of a lot of the content that we're after doing and more and more. And also I have a lot of classes available digitally. That's on Yoga Glow. There's something like 70 classes online available. And then I also spend about 3 or 4 years developing what is the most comprehensive in-depth yoga training online. Which people can interface with as well. And there are links to that on my website as well. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, no, people want to go deeper than the interview is just a toe in the water. People want to go all the way to the deep end, for sure. All right, so last 3 questions, and we'll have to keep them short because we need to keep the
okay, I'll do my best.
Okay. So one thing that happens when people hear about purpose, when they hear about this, soul level purpose, is fears, concerns, and reservations arise. So, as a psychotherapist, I use the word subpersonalities or facets of self, the protector, the critic, the skeptic. And there are worries like, I hear these ones a lot, and I'm wondering how you encourage people to work with these. Like, well, if I find my purpose, I won't be any good at it. What if I find it? What if I don't find it? What if I find it and I can't make a living at it? What if I find it and I live it and people make fun of me? People think, oh my God, you're strange and weird and shun me. So there are these other agendas, to be liked and appreciated, to be successful and so forth. So how do you work with or, elicit courage to work with those subpersonalities that are like, oh, I don't think I'm that, up for this game?
Let me say that my teacher's teacher, different one, he said that the secret to life is to discover your purpose, and then, so it's twofold: discover your purpose and then learn to love it. And I'm so appreciative that he made that distinction, because finding it out doesn't mean you fell in love yet. And so what I would say is and that's why I mentioned earlier, we're all being driven. Even the voices that you kind of gave, the narrative you gave voice to earlier of, oh, this is scary, oh, I'll never get accomplished, oh, I can't be successful. Those are driven by these other kind of orphan step purposes that we've taken on. And so that's why the book and the process really speaks to identifying them. And in the end, to answer your question, and you use the word perfectly, it's courage. We're never fearless. I mean, I hate the word. I don't like the word fearless. I discourage people from using the word fearless. The best you can hope for is courage in the face of fear. And so I really, so what I ask people to do is to think about, is to uncover them. What are these voices? And then ultimately to acknowledge the pain for not living your purpose. And we have to get to a point where the pain of not living the purpose is greater than the pain of facing the fears of living your purpose. And that's simply a decision, Jonathan. That's a decision. We have to make that decision and not fictionalize the reality that my fears are actually more painful than stepping into my purpose. We fictionalize it for a reason, and there's a payoff, but it's not real. And that's hard to see, but it's a vital piece of the process. It's the critical piece in this process, as you said, to not get trapped, to not live your purpose.
Yeah, great. All right, and then the second to last question is actually not a question; it's an invitation, and it's to your soul. So I've controlled the conversation to a degree by asking these questions that I think are relevant. Is there something inside that is just naturally, effortlessly bubbling up that you want to share with the people who are listening right now? That your soul just feels like, yeah, before this conversation is over, I'd really like to offer these words or this transmission.
I would maybe two things come to mind, and I wasn't prepared for it, but two things come to mind, which is, number one is don't postpone your happiness, and living in alliance with the conversation, the content that we've had, the conversation that we've had, living in alliance with your soul's purpose is the critical part of being happy. It's the critical part, and so start the work. Start and begin the work of, step into this adventure is what I would say. And so don't postpone your happiness is one. And the second thing, which is really coupled with that, is the idea of not waiting till you're in the mood. In other words, the teacher I just quoted about the secret to happiness is this twofold idea of find your purpose, then fall in love with it. He also said that the first step in this path is sankalpa shakti. So to translate that means it's the power of will and determination. In other words, you may or may not be inspired by this conversation or by other luminaries in this curriculum of purpose, the conversation around purpose. You may be inspired, but it may be very short-lived. And so that means without a certain level of will, you can never actually manifest what is behind that momentary aspiration. We have to stay forthright. We have to, in the end, very quickly. Recently, I was asked in a private consultation, someone said, I met with this person about a year earlier, and it's unusual for someone to need another meditation quite that quickly, sometimes, but not always. And I was surprised to see her. And she said, the only reason I wanted to meet was I've had a really hard time practicing. And I'm just wondering, do you have a practice to help me practice? And I said, no, I gave you the practice. And in other words, it does require just will. The mood may never strike you, or it may be so fleeting as to just make your progress so slow and so cobbled together that it just doesn't actually ever manifest. So number one, don't postpone your happiness. And number two, be willful.
Willful, beautiful. I like the way you've rehabilitated the word in a sense. So excellent. All right, so here's the last question, and you totally don't have to play ball with this. It's something that came up spontaneously when I started this series with people. So I have a son. He's 8 years old. His name is Yi, Y-I. We adopted him from Korea when he was 10 months old. And I have this plan on his 18th birthday to create a little video from all these people that I've been interviewing. And here's what the ask is. I'm asking teachers from their heart to say something, to begin by saying something like this. Hi, Yi. It's 2027, 10 years from now. You're 18, and your father has asked me to just offer you something about purpose. So if, in fact, you are hungering and longing and aching for purpose, here's just one pith thing that I want to offer you. You don't have to say it just like that, but that's the general idea. So if you are willing, you can just say, "Hi, Yi. I'm Rod Stryker, and John, your father asked me to just offer you this birthday gift of a few words about purpose." And it may appear actually on this whole video, or it may be a B-reel. We'll see. We'll probably include it. But.
All right. So, hi, Yi. I'm Rod Stryker, and your dad asked me to speak to you on this occasion of your 18th birthday about how to live a meaningful life, a life of purpose. And the answer is really my guidance or suggestion would be a very simple one. You can say it in just a few words, and that is nurture your Dharma. Your Dharma means to really discover what it is you're uniquely here to do and to become. It is unique within you. And so consistently, or even always, nurture that. And the Dharma will always nurture you.
Thank you for the gift for my son. I'm looking forward to 2027
Okay.
and offering that. Yeah, thank you. All right. Well, thank you so much for giving of your time, your heart, the depth of your study, the sincerity of your work in the world, and even just the humanity of it. You know, you're saying that one part of your purpose is good, healthy self-care. I'm so glad you brought that in. We went lofty into non-duality and purpose, but you really sort of covered the whole thing of, waking up and taking care of your everyday life and also leaning into purpose. So a very integral approach of which I resonate with and deeply appreciative that you're out there in the world writing. And I know you're working like crazy. I've looked at your website and your schedule. So thank you for your gift of service.
Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan, for putting this together and including me in the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Look forward to seeing you at the next interview. And you can find more of these interviews at purposeguides.org. Bye-bye.